Hello, I'm Adam Hart and I'm Professor of Science Communication at the University of Gloucestershire. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about citizen science, which is an aspect of science that I've been quite involved with over the last 8 years or so. First of all, then, we should define our terms. Science is fairly straightforward to define, although you can put people on the spot when you ask them for that definition. But science is really the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural world following a systematic method. So that scientific method of observation, question, hypothesis, prediction and test, and the evidence that accrues from that, from which we build up theories and a greater understanding of the natural world. That's the essence of science. Science is about discovery. The other part of that citizen science equation, of course, the citizens. We can also define a citizen as a native or an inhabitant or a denizen, as is sometimes said, of a particular place. So we get this idea that citizen science is the linkage between people. I guess you could call them the general public, although that is a term which causes lots of head scratching, but people and science combining together. But that doesn't really quite encapsulate what we mean by citizen science on a practical sense. Actually, what we mean by citizen science is a relatively new definition. That the term citizen science is widely said to have been first coined by Rick Bonney, who's a scientist working in the United States, and Alan Irwin, both in the mid-1990s. And Irwin's definition we don't really use so much anymore. Irwin was developing this idea of scientific citizenship. So as it says here, it foregrounds the necessity of opening up science and science policy processes to the public. So Irwin was really coming at this from a sort of a process-driven situation whereby people become more engaged with science and more able to be instrumental in how science is developed. That is undoubtedly a very important component of modern science sort of engagement, but that's not really what we're talking about when we're talking about citizen science. What we're talking about when we're talking about citizen science is more the definition that Bonney put forward, which is projects in which non-scientists, and he highlights amateur birdwatchers, voluntarily contribute scientific data. And that's really what we're dealing with. We're looking, and why I call it partnerships for discovery, actually. We're looking at partnerships between professional scientists and members of the public in all their various guises and in all types of different sections, not everyone at once necessarily, but specific groups sometimes. And those partnerships allow scientists to harness and to capture more data than they could ever possibly do without the help of the public. As always, of course, there's nothing that new under the sun. I found this passage from New Scientist back in the 1970s, where the specific phrase "citizen scientist" is put forward when they're talking. James Oberg here is talking about ufology, or the study of UFOs, and it's quite, I think, useful to read this. If ufology is not a science, then what is it? It might be considered as a protest movement against the impersonality and specialization of modern science, which has all but eliminated the role of the citizen scientist, the amateur investigator, who in the past contributed substantially to the development of science through part-time dabbling. And that's really important when you think of it. Darwin was not a professional scientist. Darwin was on the Beagle as a dining companion for Fitzroy. He wasn't there as a professional scientist. He wasn't affiliated with a university. He wasn't a scientist in the sense that we would think of it now. He was an amateur in every sense of the word. He was a lover of what he did. He was an incredibly knowledgeable individual. But I think we can think of him as more than a dabbler, right? But he was nonetheless a citizen scientist. And it's this idea that citizen science allows us to work in partnership with the public in develop members of the public, sometimes specific members of the public, to become very integral to our research, that I think is quite exciting. But also for me as an ecologist, I find this sort of approach exciting because, as we'll see, it gives us great coverage that we simply wouldn't have if we worked on our own. So lots of people have sort of struggled with coming up with a definition, and there's almost as many definitions of citizen science as there are citizen scientist practitioners, scientists that use it. But essentially what we're talking about is a research collaboration that is performed by untrained, amateur or non-expert individuals. That's not always the case, as we'll see. Most bird ringing in this country is done by highly expert amateur birdringers who work in association with scientists based at universities or larger organisations. So we can also think of it as the involvement of volunteers in science, where those volunteers perhaps have more to give than just a data point or a sort of non-expert opinion. They may well be very expert in their area, but they're not professional. Or we can make it wider, and we can talk about the public participation, or the participation of the public in scientific research. And that's also, all of these sort of overlap, and to a certain extent, I don't think it matters too much. I think we know it when we see it. It is us working with the public. We can see in my field, so I'm interested in ecology. I'm also an entomologist. I'm interested in lots of these sorts of areas, and in my field, I think we've been really quite instrumental in pushing this forward. It's been quite a dominant feature, actually. Citizen science no longer appears in the title of papers that use it as a method. It used to be a sort of gimmick, right? We're using citizen science, isn't it incredible? But now it's not. It's a well-established part of the toolkit, and indeed quite a lot of long-term record schemes, and a lot of the long-term data that we rely on in ecological research comes from, in effect, a citizen science background. So butterfly conservation, for example, runs a butterfly recording scheme with over 15,000 volunteer recorders. That's been an incredibly successful scheme to keep on top of butterfly abundance and diversity and distribution in this country. Likewise, much as I mentioned earlier, much of the bird ringing data and a lot of the information that we get about migratory birds appearing in the UK and about nest productivity and so on comes from a fairly small group. I mean, actually quite a lot of people, but fairly small when you think about it, a small section of highly trained people who are working in collaboration with scientists, but they're doing it for free. They're giving their time for free, and they're not professional in that sense. But of course, the word amateur has real pejorative sort of feel about it. We use it linguistically to sort of mean someone that doesn't really know what they're doing. That is absolutely not the case when we're dealing with many of the amateurs that do an awful lot of the ecological monitoring and surveying around the UK. They really do know what they're doing, very much so. And we're lucky within ecological monitoring because we actually have a whole range of different organisations, many of which are entirely voluntary and then run off a shoestring, but often have linkages to academic programs. So Bee Wars, the Bees, Wasps Ants Recording Society. We've got Spider and Harvestman recording schemes. We've got National Moth recording schemes, amphibian recording schemes, fly recording schemes, pretty much anything, the crane fly recording scheme, pretty much anything that you can think of. There is actually a recording scheme in the UK run by amateurs, run by citizens, that interact with professional scientists, but that do the bulk of the work themselves. So this notion of citizen science isn't really new within biology. It's been going on for a long time. And what these schemes rely on are, well, a small group of volunteers often, but what they rely on is a little bit of brain power, but also time. So it's a combination of brain power and time. We need these volunteers to go out, commit themselves to doing this work and use their expertise. That's one form of citizen science, but actually the form of citizen science that I'm more interested in, and that I think is generally of more interest to a lot of people, is this idea of mass participation citizen science. The idea that all of the public are potentially your research partners, and you're asking them to do something, for example, to report some phenomenon or something, and by doing that you can gain a greater insight. And I first came across this when I was quite young. This is a man called Mike Majerus, who started the UK Ladybird Survey. And I can remember watching him on Blue Peter. I was 7 or 8 at the time, I think, talking about how we could help with this. And I submitted records to this. It was old school. You submitted them on a piece of paper. So you actually filled out a form and you posted it off, and as a consequence, they were able to build up these distribution maps. And it's kind of personally quite nice for me. I went on to study. I did my undergraduate dissertation with Mike. He was my dissertation supervisor, and the UK Ladybird Survey is taken over by Helen Roy, who I now work with really closely with the Royal Entomological Society. So I kind of feel like the UK Ladybird Survey has always been there in the background of lots of aspects of what I do, even though I haven't really been part of it other than putting in some samples, some surveys. But obviously this has all changed now. We don't ask people to fill in forms anymore. This has changed, but the same principle is still there, that we can take advantage. It sounds quite exploitative, but actually people enjoy doing this. But we are taking advantage of properties of the general public, which are very important. They are ubiquitous, right? We have people everywhere. Yes, they're focused in towns and cities, but we have good general coverage of the country, and they're very keen often to take part in these things, and they will do in large numbers. So in mass participation citizen science projects, we're often asking less of people. We're not asking them to go out and ring birds or use highly specialized knowledge. We're perhaps asking them to report a phenomenon. You've seen a ladybird. Can you tell what it is from this chart? And if not, can you submit a photograph and we'll try and work it out. In my case, I've done quite a number of studies, and if I talk you through it, I'm going to look at a couple of them or one of them in more depth in a moment, but I asked people to report flying ant emergencies. So you'll probably know in the summer, kind of July time, we get these emergencies of winged reproductive ants from the ground, and it causes great consternation, and it's a big media event, often Flying Ant Day. But it turns out we didn't really know that much about Flying Ant Day. We don't know how coordinated they are across the country, what the environmental triggers and so on are, because to get that sort of information, we need to have information from across the country, from throughout the summer period across several years, and that's just not possible to do if you're working on your own as a scientist. But if you pair with the partner with the public, and you can enthuse them about it and say to people, listen, I need to find out about this, can you help us? They'll go online, they'll download apps, they'll fill in, yes, we saw flying ants, it was this time, it was here, and we can start to develop really, really in-depth knowledge of those sorts of phenomena. The same with we asked people to fill in surveys about Starling murmurations and tell us where they saw them, and various factors about them, and it allowed us to work out really quite a lot of things about their ecology, which we just didn't know before, because we didn't have enough data. Because to get enough data just wouldn't be feasible for one person or even a small group. It was having that coverage across the country that's crucial. And that's where citizen science, mass participation citizen science, can really come into its own. But also, and I think we're going to see this more and more, we can sort of take a few of the keenies, if you like, the super engagers, and we can say, listen, brilliant, and we can direct them into different things, and we can bring them along into the project and get them to do more and more complex things. And I'll talk about that at the end. So Ecology then has lots of citizen science projects in there. There's all kinds, and I'm just going to give you a quick flavour, but I could be here all day. I get my postgrad students to do an exercise where we try to take a snapshot of the citizen science landscape in ecology, and over the last couple of years it's become very complex, actually. One of the students last year said that it made them feel sick, and I can sort of see where they were coming from, because there were just so many studies out there and so many ways for people to get involved. It all starts to become a little bit confusing and possibly also confused. And I'm sure that will iron out as sort of natural competition between projects sort of eliminates a few, and we get a sort of settling of the landscape. But here's a project Budburst. This is a timing project. It's trying to find out about the timing of spring and the emergence of plants. So it wants people, as soon as you see this, happening, to report it, and it's got an app and all sorts of things that you can do. And this has been going on for a number of years in North America. It's very important for us to get some handle on how climate change, for example, is influencing the timing of events in the natural world. We can also use it to look at plant diseases, and this is a big application for it. This is a citizen science app that's used to monitor ash dieback, and there's a couple of those. We've got other apps that monitor invasive plants, which is a really important feature that's very hard to do. But anyone that takes their dog out for a walk can see whether or not they can find Himalayan balsam and report where it is. You can get a real sort of deep knowledge, actually, of where these things are emerging and where you can focus your efforts. So it can be very, very useful for invasive species and diseases. This is an interesting project that's ongoing. It's called Project Splatter, and it's about roadkill. It's mapping roadkill, and they've got some fantastic data out of this and some really interesting work that's come out of this. But it's not just about finding out what's dying out there. It's finding out where it's dying, which species are being affected, how we might mitigate that. What can we do to stop? Are there certain interventions we can have? Are there stretches of road that we need to improve? So these sorts of citizen science campaigns can be really, really useful, and projects can be really, really useful for practical applied projects as well, not just for sort of academic information. We can really get something out of them. And of course, if we want people to take part, we have to have a bit of a hook, right? We have to become salespeople, marketers. We're trying to sell our project to people, and we want them to give up their time, download an app, go to some inconvenience in some cases in order to give us data. So to do that, we really have to learn how to sell this stuff. And a good title, Project Splash, is going to gain some interest. You have to learn how to interact and engage with journalists and the media to try and get the coverage that you need. Because if you rely on having mass coverage, those people have got to know about it. And for them to know about it, you have to be able to get the message out. So it really becomes quite a complicated thing when you oversee one of these projects, because you've got the science, you've got to take care of the citizens, and you've got to manage the two sort of meeting up, and that involves a lot of skills actually, and a lot of time trying to get your message out there. So this is one of the plant tracker apps I was mentioning earlier about looking at non-native and invasive plants. And the key really to all of these is that we are talking in these mass participation studies of professional scientist-led projects, potential mass participation from the public, generally with a relatively straightforward task, usually with no training or very little required for the participants. And this has been very important, for me, there's education and awareness raising, which can be as important as the science. When I started a project with Syrian Sumner down in UCL on wasps. It's called the Big Wasp Survey, and our main reason for doing that was to find out more about wasp distribution and abundance and patterns over time. But actually quite a big part of it was to be able to get a bit of a platform that we can get the message out that, wasps aren't as bad as you think. They're actually ecologically very important. They have a number of useful roles. They're more complex than you imagine. They've got fabulous social lives, or interesting, at least from a biological perspective. So it's really getting that platform and getting that ability to be able to reach people, and the project captures people's interest. It gives you that extra add-on, which for me is important. My role is I'm a professor of science communication. These projects give me a really good way to communicate some of that science as well as develop the science itself. So you can develop some amazing publications from this. Some of the citizen science stuff that you see being published now across the world, really, really interesting stuff. But in all cases, or in many of those cases, there's also been this awareness raising, this education, this platform that they give you. So it can all work together very, very neatly. And I think that's something that's really useful to come from it. Underpinning it all, of course, you have to have solid science. And there's a whole load of ethical conversations that go on now about, citizen science projects should make the data widely available. There should always be an aim in mind. It shouldn't just be we're going to raise awareness about this thing by collecting a bunch of data and then just letting it stew in a Excel sheet that no one opens. We really have to have an end point in mind that there's a proper project underpinning it, but it can give you a great platform to get the message out and to engage with lots and lots of people. If we look across time at citizen science, we will see an enormous uptick here. And this, the last few years has gone through the roof as well. Interestingly, citizen science appears in articles and stuff, as it appears in topics and titles, has tended to level off a little bit, because we don't need to have it in the title anymore. We found this out by citizen science. It's just we found this out. It's part of the method. But the reason why we've seen this huge uptick is very, very simple and straightforward. We all carry in our pockets now fabulous devices that allow us to communicate pretty much instantly with almost anyone, and to be able to upload data, photographs, geotagged images, all kinds of things that enable us as scientists to harvest data that even 20 years ago would be unimaginable, even 10 years ago actually, let's be honest, even 5 years ago would be unimaginable. And back in 2000, people were, you still had a computer that you went to in a house, maybe you had a laptop, you certainly didn't have a tablet. And then suddenly we've got phones and smartphones and the internet, and it's just ballooned. It's absolutely ballooned, and that's the reason why citizen science has flown. It's pure and simple. It's access. It's much easier for us as scientists to set things up and for people to take part. And once that connection is solid, it's just absolutely mushroomed. So that rise. Technology driven, and one of the disadvantages, of course, with technology expanding so quickly and developing so quickly is that as soon as you get the hang of one platform, SurveyMonkey used to be what it was all about, right? You'd set up a SurveyMonkey and it was great, still very useful actually, but now everyone's moving on to apps. and you'd get an app built, and now you can build your own app, and then you can piggyback on other apps, and you think, okay, I'm going to get my message out on social media, I'm going to be all over Twitter, and then suddenly you realize that everyone's on Instagram, so you go to Instagram and then everyone's moving to something else. So it is a challenge as well to keep up with the technology, but it's a huge opportunity. So I'm just going to talk briefly about one of the sub-studies that I've done, just to give you a flavour for the sorts of data that you can collect. I did a spider survey with the Royal Society of Biology and a few other people, and the idea was that we wanted to find out more about spider season, which we're kind of in at the moment. We get these larger house spiders, as they're called, Tegenaria and a couple of other genera, coming into our houses, causing great alarm among some people, and all kinds of newspaper stories about, giant spiders are invading the country. Not true. It's just autumn, nothing to get too excited about. But as with the flying ants I mentioned earlier, we don't know that much about it. There's been a couple of studies. One was done in sort of a fairly small area of Yorkshire, for example. But we needed to find. We wanted to find out much more about the national pattern. Is there a north sort of south kind of movement? Is there a south to north movement, for example? Does it migrate north with autumn, where we start seeing these emergencies? How do they decay over time? Where do we find them? Lots of people say it's the males moving around looking for females. Well, is that true? You can sex them fairly easily if you can get close enough and have a look at the front end around here with their sort of boxing glove-like palps. Which rooms are particularly preferable to them? We can find out quite a lot about spider sort of household ecology, if you like, from this, as well as some very basic information about spider season, when it starts, when it finishes, and so on. So we set up a very basic app and a very basic recording portal, and asked people to go on, and we were very lucky. It was a slow news day when my press release hit the wires, and it ended up as a front page story in the Daily Star. They kind of didn't, that's not really what I said in the press release, right? I didn't say we're being attacked by giant spiders. What I said was it's been a really good summer and there's lots of prey around, and spiders are predators, so maybe they've had the chance to reach their full potential, I think was what I said. But that's been twisted here. I was a little bit, my stomach sank when I saw that headline, but then I realised actually this is all good publicity. In fact, the story, beyond the headline, the story, as is often the case in tabloids when they cover science, covered the science and the ecology incredibly well, really, really thoroughly and very evenly. And we got lots and lots of hits, and loads of newspapers picked up on this. My phone was almost melting over the 2 or 3 days after this came out. We got such a lot of coverage. We were on the Zoe Ball show and various other bits and pieces, and it was great because we got tens of thousands of app downloads. I think at one point this app was actually the most downloaded sort of kind of informative, non-fiction app, if you like, across a few days. That didn't all translate into records. There's always a drop-off in this. Lots of people are enthused about it. They have to do something else. They have to do something else. You get this decay, and we're finding out more and more about that actually as we find out more about these studies. But we still got a good number of records, 10,000 or so, across the country, that let us build up a really thorough picture actually of spider season. So we had all kinds of graphs. This is just to show you some of the data that you can get. So we got this lovely decay graph. This isn't just down to people losing interest, so you can control that for the amount of coverage you've got and app downloads and all that sort of stuff. So this is a sort of real phenomenon. We found that 82% of them were males, as we suggested, or as had been suggested, but not thoroughly tested. You can find out what time they're most likely to be seen, which is about 7:30. Now that is also unfortunately the time that people sit down to watch the television quite often, but by looking at patterns through the rooms and various other bits and pieces, again you can control for that a little bit. But when you're involved in citizen science, you do have to allow for the fact that you're also sometimes measuring properties of the citizens. So, for instance, flying ants, if you were to just look at our distribution map, you would conclude that flying ants were very, very common in cities and towns. Well, actually, no. Our distribution maps, if you just look at them in raw form, pretty much mirror population density across the UK. You have to dig a little bit deeper, but we were aware of that. We were aware of some of the data problems, but they do generate a lot of data problems, some of these projects. And in the case of flying ants, we ended up actually taking on a data analyst for several months to sort out some of these things and get to the bottom of them, because it was rapidly becoming a more complex problem than we were able to fix. So that is something that's worth thinking about. You can end up generating a lot of data. It's a nice problem to have, but it's still a problem. And we were also able to delve in and get lots of stuff. I'm not sure how clear this slide will be on whatever screen, but basically we were able to look at rooms and look at sex ratios in different rooms, for example, look at the location within the rooms, look at the location within sex, look at the timings of the sightings, and piece together some really quite interesting nuances of spider ecology from the very basic data that we were asking people to collect. I was really surprised how many people wanted to take part in this, and I was also surprised at how many people submitted sex data, which, well, taken out of context doesn't sound good, but the sex of the spider data, because that involves getting quite close to the spider to find out. We got lots of people sending us photographs and all sorts of things, and quite a lot of nice emails from people saying, I used to be terrified of spiders, I'm trying to, you know, your projects made me appreciate them a little bit, and I'm trying to do this, and here's my data, and I'm, you know, it was really, I felt like the awareness raising and the sort of engagement with the science of it was having some traction, which was really interesting. So what's the future of citizen science? Well, I think we're going to find us making more complex use of citizens. I'm already starting to do that with the Big WASP survey that I mentioned earlier. We've now got a group of about 1,200 dedicated trappers who help us. We were able to use a smaller group of those, about 300 or so, to field test for us a new identification scheme during the COVID crisis, and then an even smaller group actually then gave us some really detailed feedback about how we could do that. None of that would have been possible, you know, without this form of sort of partnership developing. We recruited those people 3 or 4 years ago. They've stayed with the project. They are very much our research partners now, and we're able to make more complex use of them, and they want to. You know, we said to them, would you be willing to help us develop this identification app? And within half an hour, 600 of them, we couldn't believe it when it came in. I assumed it was just auto replies or a fault with the email, but about half of them had replied, I think within an hour of getting that email saying, yes, we'd love to. You know, maybe a lockdown effect and people are looking for things to do perhaps, but they were really, really enthused and really, really keen to be involved. I think because that sense of partnership, and we keep them informed with what we do, and you know, keep them up to date with various sort of channels and platforms. But it's a really valuable partnership for us, just as any other collaborative partnership is valuable. You know, this just happens to be a partnership with 1,200 people who, you know, will probably never physically meet. And that leads into the next step, which is that I think we can start being more subtle with our levels of engagement. You know, we can build up projects where we have perhaps 50,000 people are giving us one piece of information, but some of them will give us 2, and then we can bring some in, and we can end up with these super engagers who are going the whole hog. And I think for, you know, some of the health things that I've been discussing with people, that type of different levels of engagement is really very interesting sort of direction of travel for this. You know, you don't have to have one project where people do one thing and that's the end of it. You can actually have a more subtle sort of graded project where you think more about how people are going to be engaged. I think that will lead to directed action, where we'll actually be able to say to people, you know, in my field, it might be, we don't have very many records about 10 miles from you. You know, would you go and survey this area? Or, you know, we need some flying ant data and we're not sure what's happening at the end of July. Can you keep a close eye out in your garden for that? You know, we can actually engage people in a more directed way than just this sort of blanket, just contact us when you've got some data. And I think that's going to be interesting. And I suppose everybody's always looking for interdisciplinarity and so on, but I think we are going to see some real cross-discipline things developing, because when you're collecting information on something involving people, you're also collecting some potentially valuable information in terms of people. But of course, that also has ethical and in some cases legal ramifications. So this sort of landscape is, you know, becomes a little more complex as you get deeper into it. But these are all problems that can be solved, and actually often advantages and opportunities. I think we might also see more passive citizen sensing or passive citizen science in the form of citizen sensing. Things like Twitter mining and sort of social media mining are fairly well known. This guy wearing the glasses there, that's Google Glass, never really took off, but it will, right? We're all carrying around microphones in our pockets. If you walk through and you hear birdsong, your phone will hear birdsong too. And actually, if it geolocates where you are and enough people walk around, we could probably map the territories of birds if there's enough people walking around entirely passively if we had access to microphones. That, of course, is a legal and an ethical implication. We're all generating data all the time. Data scientists use those data. Other people use those data, including political scientists. But perhaps we can also start to make use of those data in different ways. All of this, of course, has with it a whole load of other baggage, and in some cases that can be quite tricky. Even just using images that are posted on social media can be quite difficult. So one of the things that people have started doing in ecology is making use of photos that people have uploaded that have animals with specific characteristics that allow them to be individually identified. And that can be really useful for following animals through areas, particularly if there's lots of people taking photos of them, or looking at migrations and so on. But equally, those photos, if they're uploaded, haven't been uploaded for that purpose. You are using them for purposes that aren't there. They may be geotagged. They may be of endangered species that are geotagged. There can be all kinds of issues, and we're thinking those through in ecology, and I think it's very, very wise at the beginning to think through those things quite carefully. For our Starling survey, for example, we asked people to report those amazing murmurations you see in the sky. A very common time for them to happen is sort of 5 o'clock, which is a very common time for people to be driving home. And what we didn't want was people sort of putting their car into a ditch to try and get information about this murmuration. So part of our kind of directions were taking account of that. It's a form of risk assessment, but any study that you do has some implications. So I think that's something that all of us are becoming much more aware of, and some of the subtleties of it as we get more into doing different things. But just to finish, I'd just like to sort of emphasize what I kind of started with, actually, that for a while citizen science became more about the method than about the findings, and it became a very cool thing to do, and there were lots of projects, and I followed some of those projects through, and I didn't see an end result. I didn't really know what they were going to do, and they didn't actually produce any what we would call science. There's no publications that have come out of it. I couldn't access the data. We're starting to move away from that now, and that's good. But it's always well to realize that however snazzy the technique, whether it's citizen science or whether it's some machine that goes ping, underlying it all is the scientific method. And that's observation, question, hypothesis, prediction, test. And it's those observations and questions at the beginning that underlie all of it. And that's actually something that I think we can also make use of in terms of citizen science, because not only are we crowdsourcing observations, but we could also start to crowdsource observations and ideas and questions. And that's really, really important. And I think that will be developed by developing these partnerships between science and the public that are built much more on sort of solid, firm foundations, and also on trust. And within citizen science, we have to make sure that we live up to that trust. So that's a sort of a cautionary note. But citizen science is I found it an incredibly valuable way to get data, to build up partnerships, both collaborative research partnerships within sort of professional scientists, but also those partnerships with the public. And I find it a really, really rewarding way to go about doing science. Thank you very much.